Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. People enjoyed the last rare items video I made, so I'm back with round 2. In this video, I'll show you 10 more super rare items in the game, and I'll also share the story and the history behind them and explain why they're so rare. Keep in mind, as the title says, this list will include items that are no longer obtainable. Just throwing that out there since some people have a problem with that. The basic criteria I try to keep is that the item had to have been in a player's inventory at one point or another. And another thing is that this list isn't really in a super strict order, but I'll try to save the best for last. First up, we have the Haunted Memento. This was tied to the old Scourge invasion event that kicked off the original Naxxramas raid. Undead enemies would spawn throughout the world, including the outskirts of capital cities, and you got rewarded with various things if you fought them off. The Haunted Memento was dropped by these mobs, and if you had it in your inventory, a ghostly shade would follow you wherever you went. So it was pretty common back in the day, but due to it being a unique item and the source being cut off 11 years ago, the supply has dwindled a bit. It's now highly sought after by collectors, and you can pick one up on the auction house occasionally, but due to their rarity, they go for hundreds and thousands of gold. The shade doesn't do anything, of course, it's just a cosmetic thing pretty much. It's a classic item, and it even has a toy referencing it that you can get from the Darkmoon Fair. Next up, we have the original level 60 Warblades of the Hakari. These aren't super rare, which is why I have them pretty early on in the list, but they're quite unique and cool, which makes up for it in my book. And the supply has been cut off, so they are rare to some degree. You got these from the original Zul'Gurub instance from the final boss, Hakari the Soulflayer. They're actually part of a set, which is quite unique. If you have both of them equipped, you get some haste rating and the yellow text reads, "Forged in the seething flames of hatred." Another interesting thing about them is that they sheath on the back, which is kind of unique, and they have a default purple glow to them. These are no longer obtainable since the raid was re-released during the Cataclysm expansion, so it's fairly rare to see people running around with them these days. They were reincarnated with the Cataclysm version, but they were turned into daggers instead. They're probably my favorite set of swords in the game, at least out of the ones that I own. So, like I said, not the rarest, but interesting enough to share, I thought. For items 3 and 4 on our list, we're visiting the Uldaman instance again. Like I said in the previous video, this dungeon is a treasure trove of rare items. The reason for this is when Cataclysm was released, the levels of all of the mobs in most of the dungeons were altered, and the way the BOE loot drops work is mobs have to be within a certain level of the level of that item. So, in vanilla, these items could drop from nearly any mob in the instance. It was still a very low chance, but multiplied much more than it is now. After Cataclysm and the level changes, only a few mobs were left to still be in that range. So, for a lot of these items, the amount of eligible mobs went from hundreds to 10, 5, or even 1 in some cases. And that's the case with our next item, the Miner's Hat of the Deep. This is the only black miner's hat in the game, and it's up there on the list of the rarest items that are still obtainable. The only place it's been confirmed to drop is the final chest at the end of the instance, so to farm it you have to go through the entirety of the instance every time. And the drop rate is very low. Like less than 0.01% people have speculated. There are currently only 4 up across every US server, and it goes for an upwards of 4.5 million gold. So, if you do get it, whatever you do, don't vendor it. The other Uldaman drop I wanted to bring up is the Jackhammer. You may remember in the previous episode I brought up the Pendulum of Doom. Well, this is its little brother. This is a two-handed mace, and before it was changed, it had a lightning fast 2.5 speed. And it also had a 30% attack speed proc, and combining that with its already fast speed gave you the fastest two-handed swings possible. It wasn't an ideal twinking weapon unfortunately though, because it required level 40, which was of course just outside the 30 to 39 bracket. So, because of that, not a lot of people held on to it, which makes it more rare these days. In fact, it hasn't been seen on any US server's auction house since August 6, 2015. The person who sold it had no idea of its value and sold it for just 100 gold. There hasn't been any confirmed drops in quite some time, so no one knows if it's even possible to loot it anymore. But if by some miracle you do happen to pick it up, you're in for a lot of gold, or 100 gold at least. Next up we have rhok'delar and lok'delar, the old purple hunter weapon set. In the Molten Core raid from the Major Domo Executus fight, there is a chance to loot something called an Ancient Petrified Leaf. This wasn't a piece of gear, but rather a quest starter that sent you on a very difficult series of challenges, and at the end of it, you were awarded with the rhok'delar bow, the lok'delar staff, and an 18-slot bag that held ammo and gave you 15% attack speed back when ammo bags were a thing. It required you to kill 4 different demons at 4 corners of the world solo. If you had friends, a pet, or even a random stranger trying to help you, the mobs would despawn and you would have to start all over. It was quite the challenge, and each boss had specific strategies, and if you didn't use potion or other random gadgets, you would be hard pressed to complete it during that raid tier. This was the stave portion of the quest, which gave you lok'delar. As for the bow, you just had to kill a Nyxia and loot an item called the Black Dragon Sinew. So, nothing too challenging there, as most guilds had her on farm by the time they were killing Executus. The last part awarded the quiver, and it required you to loot a Blue Dragon Sinew from either Azurgos at a 100% rate, or some Winterspring Dragons at a much smaller rate. The leaf, and therefore the quests, were removed when the Cataclysm expansion came out, and because of that, it's pretty rare to see any hunters walking around with these weapons. Next up, while we're on the subject of special class quests, we have the Anathema and Benediction staves for priests. These were the rewards for combining a few items together, the Splinter of Nordrassil and the Eyes of Divinity and Shadow. The Eye of Divinity you looted from Executus' chest again, and the Eye of Shadow had a very small chance to drop from various demons in Winterspring or the Blasted Lands, including the outside raid boss, Lord Kha'Zix. The Eye of Shadow was also bind on equip, which made it very lucrative in the auction house as well. Once you had both of these trinkets, as a priest you could talk to an NPC in the Eastern Plaguelands that gave you a challenge quest to save some peasants from the undead. There does exist some footage of this, but none that I own. I'll have a link in the description if you're curious though. So, as a reward for this, you got the staves. They were a little unique because they were the same staff, and you can switch forms by using them. Benediction was for healing, and Anathema was for all of the Shadow Priests. They look really slick even to this day, and you guessed it, the ability to obtain them was removed when Cataclysm was released. And next up, we'll end our special class quests with the original Quel'Serrar. This one was actually for two classes, the Warrior and Paladin, but due to the way vanilla worked back then, it was primarily used by warriors since they were really the only effective tanks for the most part. From the Diremaul instance, the bosses had a chance to drop a book called For's Compendium of Dragon Slaying. This gave you a quest to where you talk to an NPC named Lorekeeper Lydros inside of the library of the dungeon, and he'll show you an elven blade that had lost its power. You could bring life back into the weapon however, and you did this by having a Nyxia breathe fire on the blade. This allowed you to pick up an item called the Heated Ancient Blade that had just a 20-minute duration. So, during that short time interval, you had to defeat a Nyxia and use this sword on her corpse. Doing so would give you the treated Ancient Blade, and if you brought that back to the Lorekeeper, you would finally be awarded with Quel'Serrar. This was the ultimate tanking weapon for a time, and while it has been re-released, the original level 60 weapon is held by a select few. The ability to get it was removed in patch 3.2.2 during the Wrath of the Lich King, where a level 80 version was re-released along with the revamped Nyxia. Next up, we have Atiesh, or Atiesh if you prefer. I covered this in a recent video, but it does fit this list as it is quite rare. This was the caster legendary for vanilla. It was usable by mages, warlocks, druids, and priests. To get it, you had to loot 40 items called Splinters of Atiesh from the original Naxxramas 40-man raid, and if you combined them, you would get an item called the Frame of Atiesh, which then gave you a quest to obtain the head and the base of the staff. The base dropped from Cthulhu, the final boss of the AQ40 raid, and the head dropped from Kel'Thuzad himself, the final boss of Naxxramas. So, it was very challenging at the time, and the amount of guilds capable of killing both of those bosses was quite low. After you finished that part, you constructed the staff, but it was still corrupted and you had to cleanse it. To do that, you brought it to the Stratholme instance and you fought a special demon boss there. This boss also dropped a legendary sword halfway through the battle, but it had a limited duration and it was only usable in Stratholme. The majority of the people who completed this came after the next expansion was released, the Burning Crusade. It was still fairly challenging since you were only 10 levels above it, but obviously much more doable. The ability to obtain this staff was removed when the Wrath of the Lich King expansion launched due to Naxxramas being re-released. And lore-wise, it now sits in the hands of the Archmage Khadgar. And since we're talking about Naxxramas anyways, another rare weapon is the Corrupted Ashbringer. This dropped off of the Four Horsemen fight at a fairly low rate. This was the final boss of the military quarter, or what was called the Death Knight Wing back then. One of the Four Horsemen in the original was High Lord Alexandros Mograine, commonly known as the Ashbringer. He was one of the leaders of the Silver Hand, and he was eventually murdered by his son, Renault Mograine. His death corrupted the once holy weapon, giving it an undead appearance, and it became his weapon in the afterlife. This was one of the harder fights in the raid, so it was rarely seen until, just like Atiesh, people leveled to 70 and started rolling through the raid. And similar to Atiesh, the ability to obtain it was removed when Naxxramas was re-released. This is because Mograine was replaced by Baron Rivendare, so no Mograine, no Ashbringer. The neat thing about this weapon though for those who have it is that it's of epic quality and therefore transmoggable. There are a few people out there who have it, and it's always a head turner for me. There is a nod to this weapon with one of the Paladin Ashbringer artifact skins, but in my opinion, the original still looks better. And lastly for this episode, I wanted to talk about Murky. Any pet collectors out there know exactly what's coming. This is considered the holy grail of pets. You got this from the very first BlizzCon back in 2005, and for attending it you got not only the Murky pet, but even a beta key for the next expansion, the Burning Crusade. So, being the very first BlizzCon, no one knew that you would actually get some free stuff with it. There have been some other Murloc pets over time which diminished its value in a way, but this was the first and the rarest by far. Some people did hang on to keys, knowing that they could make some money off it down the line, and you can see it being sold on websites such as eBay for thousands of dollars. Obviously, I don't recommend that though, since any real-life currency trade is against the TOS, but it's still pretty crazy. So, that about covers it for this episode. Like I said in the last video, tons of rare items I missed I'm sure, but can't get to all of them in one video. And as the title says, these are just rare items, not the rarest. On that note though, if you want to go ahead and give me suggestions on stuff I missed, I might put it into the next one. Thanks in advance, and let me know if you want to see more stuff like this. I hope you found the video interesting, like it if you liked it, and thanks for watching. Peace.